Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 9th episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release an episode every 2 weeks, and on the off weeks, I publish an article on the Pine Copper Lime website featuring images and maybe a bit more information about the artist I'm going to interview. If you want to get in touch, Pine Copper Lime can be found on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and pinecopperlime.com. And this episode is publishing on the first day of the SGCI conference in Dallas. So if you're there, please come on down to the vendor fair and say howdy. I'm going to be keeping this week's intro short and sweet so we can get right to the good stuff. And this episode is chock full of it. My guest is Shayla Alarie, who is a gallerist, curator, and arts educator who I worked with for 5 years at a gallery in Seattle which housed 17,000 antique, modern, and contemporary prints. Shayla offers us an incredibly comprehensive account of the commercial side of the print world, as well as some juicy anecdotes about life as a print gallerist. At the very end, she answers some great questions I got from listeners via Instagram, so I'm just going to let her take it away. But don't forget to subscribe to Pine Copper Lime as not to miss my next episode where I chat with Allie Norman. What? Yes, the Allie Norman, about her printmaking practice, life in the Deep South, and moon magic. So, without further ado, here's Shayla. Hi Shayla, how's it going?
Hi, doing great. How are you?
I'm really good. It's good to hear your voice.
I was just about to say the same thing. Yeah, it's been too long.
It definitely has. So Shayla, probably of all the guests that I've had, you are the one that I know the best. As we used to spend, I would say, at least 50 hours a week together.
At least.
And twice on Sunday. And because we worked together at Davidson Galleries for about 5 years. And so I was doing the contemporary department and you were the director of our antique and modern department. That means that this episode is going to be a little different than what we've done in the past, in that as opposed to chatting with a contemporary artist or chatting about printmaking studio, we're actually going to be talking about the wonder of the secondary market for printmaking. But before we kind of dive into that, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself for people who don't know you and maybe tell us a little bit about your background and your training and all that good stuff.
Sure, yeah. My background is in both studio art and art history. So I started out as an artist, making art myself. Got my bachelor's degree in both, actually, and decided to go on for my graduate work in art history. That's what brought me to Seattle. And I got my master's degree in art history at the University of Washington. And I had originally intended to go on for my PhD, but at that point in time, really hadn't committed to academia. You know, I thought I was going to. And it was during that time that the position came open at Davidson Galleries. They were looking for someone who had a master's degree in art history to head up the antique and modern department. And so that's what landed me there. So it was like right place, right time, right resume. So at Davidson Galleries, in my capacity there, I managed, how did you used to put it? The other
500 years of printmaking history.
Yeah. Yeah, as opposed to the contemporary department, where you dealt with, you know, the artists living and working today. I had the other 500 years of art history, and so I dealt with everybody from Dürer and Rembrandt to M.C. Escher and Picasso. And it was really quite wonderful. Some of my particular specialties while at Davidson were Goya and artist of my heart, Kate Kolvitz. And so I managed not only like sales and inventory, but I did research and authentication for Davidson Galleries. Sometimes with prints, work would come in that we would need to authenticate. And even works that came in from a credible source, we would authenticate as well at Davidson. So a lot of research went into my position there in making sure that we had authentic pieces.
So why should contemporary artists care about the secondary market? How do you think it affects what they do in the big picture, and why do you think it's important that they're aware of it and aware of how it works?
Yeah, so with contemporary artists in particular, the secondary market is tricky. For contemporary works wherein the artist is still living, the intuitive places to resell their work are at galleries that represent them, because they're the ones that already have the clientele for the work. But very often, galleries that are showing those particular artists aren't going to want to show older works. They want to focus on new works by the artist for two reasons. Because it keeps it fresh, it keeps the artwork moving, shows a progression, in their output. But also, when you are selling secondary work, the money, in some cases, and in a lot of cases in the U.S., so I'll put a pin in that and go back to it. So in a lot of cases in the U.S., when work by a contemporary artist is sold on the secondary market, the person consigning it is the one that gets the profit. So the gallery and the consignor split the money, and the artist gets nothing. Now, that is changing. I know that the rules are different in California in particular, and in Europe. There are a lot of guidelines in place in which even work sold in the secondary market, if the artist is still living or if their estate has claim, then they're entitled to a portion of the proceeds. But there are some gallerists, one of the ones that I worked for in particular, over at Foster White, where they're cognizant of that. If they sell work by artists that they currently represent, they willingly give some of the percentage to the artist. So, so there are some galleries out there who are aware of that. But that is something to be aware of if you're a contemporary artist. Especially in the United States. If your gallery is going to be selling some of your work on the secondary market, whether or not you get a percentage of that. But usually, again, it takes a while to get to that point. It takes many, many years of selling on the primary market before you're going to start seeing work on the secondary market.
So when it comes to collectors, obviously, as you know and I know, because this was the advice we would give day in and day out, buy the work because you love it. Buy the work because you love it. Don't buy it because you're expecting to see a return. Buy it because you think the work is worth it and you know it's going to bring a value into your life. That being said, of course, we know some collectors will always ignore that or will be inclined to ignore that. Maybe that's a more gentle way to put that. So the idea that they can resell the work, do you think that can be a motivating factor for purchasing work initially from contemporary artists?
Absolutely. I think for some collectors that is a driving force. And the reason for that is primarily because of the shifting perceptions of the art market. So a little bit of background. So it began really in the 1940s. So during World War II, the U.S. became really the epicenter of the art world because so many artists fled Europe and came to New York. And that is what prompted then it to become such a prominent venue for the arts and like a landmark place for gauging what is happening in the contemporary art world. Now, so moving forward then into the 1970s and 1980s, then what we're seeing is the art market and the art world becoming increasingly conflated, wherein previously artwork had been judged more or less on the quality of it, right? So artists would ask, like, how is this relevant to my time? Or if they're part of a particular movement, let's say, like abstract expressionism, how are they answering questions or exploring aesthetic goals, for themselves and for that particular movement? The question then started to shift then is into how is this relevant to the art market? And I know that sounds pessimistic, but it is really something that artists, even now, consistently have to face when considering gallery representation is if their work doesn't happen to be in vogue, are they willing to accommodate current trends in order to get sales? And if they're not, where is their place for them then? The white cube gallery, as it were, perhaps not being that place that is right for them. So we get to a place then in the 1990s where there is inflation. So we all know this, right? We all know about the housing bubble, right? That then bursts and sends us into recession. Well, something similar happened in the arts, wherein artwork prices became increasingly inflated, and that bubble also burst. Both for contemporary artists and for some of your blue chip artists. Now, contemporary artists whose prices had been dramatically inflated in the 90s and the early aughts had a hard time recovering. Blue chip artists, and by that I mean artists who have already stood the test of time, artists that people in the art world know their names, Picasso, Jackson Pollock, Andy Warhol. So those are what we mean by like when we say blue chip artists. Even though their prices did fall, they bounced back faster, and their prices, got back to a certain level, much stronger than a lot of contemporary artists did. But what happened is it really solidified, those years really solidified in the general mind this equation of art with commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the main shift that causes people to ask that question is what is the resale value of this? That's what causes them to look at it not as this is something I love or this is something that is important to the dialogue of the art world and art history, but this is a commodity that I can then flip and make some money off of later.
Yeah, no, that's really significant because it's we all kind of hear the whispers and rumors about, well, there's actually warehouses in the middle of so and so that have millions of dollars of artwork in them that rich people are just filling as a way to launder their money, basically.
Oh well, that actually. Are you familiar with the Panama Papers?
No.
So this was a few years back. The Panama Papers were effectively these documents that contained personal financial information about wealthy individuals and public officials that had previously kept private. So effectively, it was like offshore accounts for these extremely wealthy individuals that became public and that released a lot of information about this. It was this landmark sale at Christie's for Victor and Sally Gans in 1997. And so effectively, like, it was that, like it brought to light this idea that it was really rigged, in order to get like the highest amount of money. And so there is some validity like to that.
Yeah.
There being this intent like to create like art as a commodity, to inflate the prices, to get these sales, to make like the rich richer. So if you're curious, if anybody out there is curious about this, the Panama Papers and the New York Times actually did a great article called "What the Panama Papers Reveal About the Art Market."
That sounds like that could be a whole nother podcast, like a whole nother episode we could do.
Yeah, so that's why I was like, oh, okay, I'll stop here.
So I'd love to just chat a little bit, since we've kind of covered a bit about from the artist's point of view and from the producer's point of view. But as we all know, some of the best and most supportive print collectors are print artists. So I'm sure there's some people who would love to hear just a bit about some nuts and bolts of print collecting. So if there's an artist or just anyone and they want to start print collecting, but let's say they don't have an exorbitant amount of funds to start, what's the best way for someone who's a great print enthusiast but not rich, to say it that way, to start building a nice print collection?
Sure, that's a good question. So I would say, well, first it depends, perhaps on what kind of art speaks to you. So Miranda, I know that you and I both agree that the best way to buy art is to buy what you love. You can't do anything better than to buy what you love. So that's step number one. Step number two is buy from someone reputable. Now, in the art market today, you and I both know that there are two great ways to sell your work, and one is through a gallery, through a reputable gallery. So finding a space, that has a solid knowledge of prints in particular. So there are a lot of galleries that sell prints but genuinely just don't know a lot about them.
Mm-hmm.
So you would just do better to go to a gallery that, this sounds bad, but if you can find one, unfortunately there aren't many
Yeah.
that specialize in prints. But if you can find one that specializes in prints and has an expert on staff, finding someone who's very knowledgeable to guide you. Second is to find those artists, because there are plenty who find that the gallery space is not right for them, and are selling on their own. And honestly, you can't get a better provenance than that, than buying from the artist directly. And I know a lot of artists use online sources like Instagram to sell their work. So yeah, I would maybe seek out the artists that you like, and either buy from them, or seek out those spaces that specialize in prints, and have that reputation, have that expertise, who are going to guide you. Because unfortunately, as you and I both know, there's a lot of not only like fakes and forgeries. I think a lot of people get caught up in the like, oh, is this a forgery? Is it a fake? Not that those don't exist, but more often than not, in the secondary market in particular. So if we want to bring our focus back there, what trip people up is misinformation. Is sometimes the galleries just genuinely don't know. They are misleading in their information, and then so people buy something, they thinking it's one thing and finding out it's something else completely. So that is the largest pitfall with prints on the secondary market, particularly if you're thinking of ones that are popular, like, oh goodness, Salvador Dali.
Oh, Mr.
That is a whole
Salvador.
yes, exactly. That is a whole other kettle of fish.
So maybe actually to kind of use Salvador Dali as an example, can you, just because it's to, move from the abstract to the specific, could you speak a little bit to why Salvador Dali is so problematic? Because I feel like he's a case study
Sure.
in the things that can go wrong in print collecting, especially when you're working for an artist whose all work is secondary market.
Yeah, so with Salvador Dali presents an interesting case study in the various different kinds of prints that you're going to find on the secondary market. So first are signed lifetime impressions. So working in the secondary market with prints, we know that we have multiple originals. And one of the greatest tools at our disposal are catalog raisonnés that tell us like what kind of paper something is printed on, how many of a particular edition were printed, what where the signature was located. So there's various and sundry markers then that we as dealers can look at and identify something as coming from a known edition. And then we look at the signature and authenticate the signature. And so if all of those things line up, then as a print expert, you can say with confidence, yes, this is something from this edition that we see here historically recorded. It meets all of the parameters. With my eyes, I can see this and know that it is, let's say, a lithograph, with hand color, and you can identify it as such, and you know the things to look for. So that is best case scenario. So second to that is a restrike. So a restrike is something that is from an original plate, stone, or block, so the original matrix, but is done posthumously. And so it's not a fake or forgery, but it's not a lifetime signed impression either. It can still be a quality print, but if it's not marketed truthfully, then someone could buy something that does have value, but maybe pay more for it than it's worth. So you have the lifetime signed impressions, or even like lifetime impressions that are unsigned, because those exist, versus a restrike. And then, so the next one down the line, our collaborative prints, and this applies to Dali in particular. And so those are ones in which he was aware and perhaps even contributed to reproductions of his work, but they are in effect reproductions. So he created watercolors that he then authorized to be reproduced as lithographs. And those are some of the most problematic because they weren't very well documented. And so we don't know, for example, like what kinds of paper they're printed on or how many of each. We have a vague idea of what might have been done. And so even though you could get a print, so we can look at something and say, yes, this is a lithograph, and we can look at it and identify it as such, it's not a lifetime impression. It is still, in fact, a reproduction. And then beyond that, that's when you get into the straight up fakes and forgeries, things that were produced either in ways that we're just unaware of, that aren't documented, and so a dealer just shouldn't touch, or they are straight up reproductions that people are then unaware of as having any sort of difference between a reproduction and an original print. So like Lincoln and Dolly Vision, for example, is one of the prime examples. It's a reproduction. Like, it was a painting that Dolly made, and there are many, many, many reproductions of it, some of which he signed, but they're still reproductions. Mm-hmm. And so just because something has a pencil signature on it does not mean it's an original print, and it does not mean that it is valuable. It's a signed poster.
Right. So it essentially has the value that any famous person's autograph would have in that situation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so again, not that it's not valuable or doesn't have any value, it's just not going to have the same value as like a lifetime signed impression of, a Dolly work, which is, Dolly is very difficult to authenticate because, of all of the, just all of the complexities, and all of the different versions of his work that he released. And of course, there's like always a rumor, and this is something that people would always bring, is like, oh yeah, Dolly just signed a bunch of blank pieces of paper and had his publishers print on them, right? I'm like, not exactly. Mm-hmm. He did give broad license to publications of his work and kind of sign things willy-nilly, but it's kind of a myth. Not as straightforward as it sounds. I mean, so it's one of those things where it's like it's based in fact, but not necessarily 100% true. Well, the most useful thing I can say about Dolly prints is don't buy one on a cruise.
Yeah.
Just don't buy any art on a cruise, actually.
Yeah.
Just don't do it.
So could you ever, with a clear conscience, recommend someone who may not have the resources to do basically authentication themselves? As you said, the catalog raisonnés are so important, and a lot of them are so rare that they cost more than some of the prints from some of these artists, the raisonnés themselves, to ever buy from an auction, even a reputable auction, if they're going for prints.
Yeah, so auctions, some of them have authentication. So some of them have a team that does do authentication and quality control. Others do not. Auctions are, in general, a buyer beware arena. So it just depends on where you're going. If it's a smaller local auction house, I would apply the same logic. If it's something you love, even if you buy it and you find out it's not an original print, are you still going to love it for the price? Is it worth it to you? Then yeah, go ahead and buy it. Knock yourself out. But if you're only buying it because you think it might have some value, like, just proceed with caution.
As long as we're talking about the whole world of the secondary print market, is condition and also the issues around conservation. Once you let's say like you've purchased a Colvitz, how are you going to keep this, so you can pass it on to your granddaughter?
That is one of the key issues when buying from auction, is because a lot of them aren't going to inspect the condition of a print. With painting and with sculpture, a lot of times you can see the condition issues. They present themselves, but with works on paper, a lot of issues can be hidden by a frame. And it's not until you open that frame are you going to be able to see the extent of the condition issues. So anything framed before the 1990s, you can expect some condition issues, because for decades, works were framed with the intention of not taking them out again. Framing was supposed to be permanent. It wasn't expected ever that the work was going to come out, because why would you need to conserve a work on paper? And so you're just going to find something, even if it was framed well. If it was framed in the 70s, there's going to be something. And so this usually comes from one of two areas. Either it's going to be burned by the acid in materials that touch it. So non-archival mat board, cardboard, even if the paper is laid against it, it's just going to be stained, from the leaching out of the acids over time. You're also going to see things like mat burn. So that comes out of the cut edge of a mat around a piece. The acid leaches out faster and creates like a brown frame around it where it's touching the paper. And then there's also toning. And toning comes from exposure to light. That is, anything that's framed, is going to be exposed to light. Even if you have the fancy UV protective glass right now, it's not going to hold out all the light. It helps, don't get me wrong. Really good museum glass is awesome and worth it if you can afford it. But nevertheless, if you put something in direct sunlight, it's still going to get through. And so, of course, non-UV glass, it's going to happen much, much faster. And then that browns the paper over time. The worst condition issues that you can ever encounter with a piece is adhesive. And so that's something that can be devastating. So I would see this particularly with work like Piranesi and Goya, mainly because they have editions that were printed much earlier in history. And so sometimes you could be looking at a frame job that was done 100 years ago, in which the work is just completely glued to a surface. So a lot of the adhesives, they cannot be removed by a conservator. They stain the work, and it just cannot be removed by most conservative processes. Often the backboard it has to be stripped off piece by piece. Like you can't float the work off of a board that it's been glued down onto. You actually have to strip it off the back of the work with some adhesives. Though conditions like matte burn and like toning usually can be cleaned depending on the severity of it, because the paper can be bleached. And it's as simple as that in a lot of cases. That with the caveat being that most prints with traditional printmaking methods like traditional intaglio and traditional lithographs are done with oil-based inks. And so a lot of the conservators' processes are based on that assumption, is that we're dealing with oil-based inks. So unfortunately, if you have any water-based inks or hand color that is water-based, you in general can't clean that unless you go to a specialist, because those inks will wash right out. You also have to be careful of any like collector stamps, any signature stamps, effectively anything that might be on the surface of that print that is water-based. If you need to clean it, it's going to wash out.
And there are definitely some collector's stamps that would add value to the piece or just add history that you would not want to lose.
Precisely, yeah. So especially with older works like with Rembrandt or Durer, for example, we have collections of notable collectors and what their collector's stamps look like. And so it can be one way to authenticate a piece if you have a particular collector's collector stamp on it, because you can trace it back to that particular provenance. And you definitely don't want to lose that because it's going to decrease the value. But the condition, also decreases the value of the work. And so, you really have to then start gauging whether or not it's worth the risk. And so to answer like the second part of your question, to preserve your own work once you buy one. So you do have, a case of Kovacs and it's in great condition because you bought it from a reputable dealer. Then, yes. So the best thing you can do again is go to a reputable framer. Shout out to Gallery Frames in Seattle. So we would often send people for example, like Gallery Frames here in Seattle, because we know they know how to handle paper and they know how to frame them carefully using all archival materials, making sure that the paper does not come in contact with anything that is not acid-free or archival. And then it's up to you whether or not you want to pop for the UV protective glass. But the more important thing is just to not hang it in direct light.
And then I think the last part that I can think of, it's interesting, like talking to you, it's like it's all coming back. But could you just maybe sort of talk briefly about provenance and certificates of authenticity?
Oh boy. Yeah. So there tended to be, in my time at Davidson Galleries, collectors who didn't know anything about print collecting, and so would come to us for guidance. Several clients who knew quite a bit, very knowledgeable and would do their own research ahead of time. And then there's that client that fell in the middle, and they tended to know just enough to know the words provenance and certificate of authenticity. And, with print collecting, those two things, they can be good, but aren't necessarily proof, of an authentic print. So with paintings and sculpture, usually you get a provenance with any particular piece because the sale records have been tracked essentially from when it left the artist's studio to when you buy it. Like that is just common. And so it's become a buzzword. But with prints, because we're dealing in a secondary market that has multiple originals, provenance is usually, not always, but usually something you just can't track. And that's because historically it wasn't tracked. Prints weren't viewed as important as paintings and sculpture. And so people just didn't keep records. And like as early as like 50 years ago, I've had clients come in to resell their own works. Like I'm talking to the person who bought it and they have no records at all of their own purchase that they can provide me. They don't even remember what gallery they bought it from because it was 50 years ago when they were in France, And so that is why then going to a dealer who has an expert on stuff, who can authenticate and has that catalog raisonné, that's why that is important. So having a provenance or lack thereof does not necessarily mean that it's good or bad. It just is when you're dealing with prints. And so certificate of authenticity then leads me to that reputable dealer again. Because any jerk with a printer can print it with their certificate of authenticity. See our note back there about never buying something from a cruise. What I was saying before about misleading information. Again, some dealers doing it deliberately and some dealers just being ignorant, of the things that they need to look for. And both of those usually end up with a certificate of authenticity with misleading or vague information. They'll have like artist title and then that's it. And then, the signature and the gallery, but the gallery closed. They were only operating for like 5 years. But you give that person that shiny gold foil covered certificate of authenticity and they feel secure, like that's money in the bank. And that is just, it's just heartbreaking because it's just so not true. I can't tell you how many people brought in, a piece that they had purchased and they hand me with confidence, their manila folder, with the bill of sale and with the certificate of authenticity. And I have to tell them, it's okay, yeah, this is a Miro, but this is, an undocumented edition of Miro. These are the ones we know of, so this is likely an unauthorized printing of his work, and I can't touch it. And so with a very, very reputable gallery, so one that has a lot of history and reputation, then you don't necessarily need a certificate of authenticity. Your bill of sale from that gallery is going to really be all that you need. But if you want one, a gallery will issue you one. Like if you ask, at Davidson, we did that, even though because of the long reputation of Davidson galleries and our own expertise there, mine and Sam's, the bill of sale usually would have been good enough. But we would often issue certificates of authenticity because people like to have them for their records, and that was fine. But the presence of a certificate of authenticity does not mean that it is authentic. It just means someone had a printer.
Yeah. And I think that that would be the really hard moments when people would come in. It's not like they were trying to, when they bought it, get a deal and scam someone out of something and feel like, oh, I got this Miro for super cheap and now I'm going to flip it. They often bought it in good faith for what was a lot of money. And they're just, I remember one particular heartbreaking moment when
I know which one you're going
the guy who came in and was like, these were for my grandkids. I'm selling these to like get money to help pay for my grandkids' college. And they were all reproductions.
Yeah, and that was actually what I was thinking of when I said Miro in particular. Yeah, because he had been buying these Miro pieces for decades, and they were his, like, he considered them like his savings account, right? The legacy, and he had brought them in to us, and he was finally going to make this money and leave this to his grandkids. And yeah, I had to tell him, and it was exactly that. They were lithographs. And they were Miros, but there were certain things like those particular Miros, for example, were only issued for Derrière le Miroir, which was a magazine. So they should have been on cheaper paper and they should have had centerfolds in them. But they were on nice paper and no centerfolds. And so with artists like Miro and with Calder, there are instances wherein there are lithographs out there, but we can't place them. We're not entirely sure where they came from, but they look like they were from some of the original stones, but not all. So you see color discrepancies. You see some parts of the print missing entirely, and then the signatures are also off. So those three things indicate that it is an unauthorized edition. And that's what this gentleman had. And yeah, it was heartbreaking. I remember I had to go, get the owner of the gallery because he didn't believe me. Mm-hmm. He was just so outraged. So I did have to go and get Sam to come down and corroborate what I had said. And he just crumbled. It was, one of the worst days I had there.
Yeah, that was a rough one. Although I think this is actually kind of a natural transition, though, speaking of having to go get the man from upstairs. Yeah. I think something that we both faced being in the print market, of course, was being young women in the field. And I think that I didn't get it as bad as you, because a lot of my art that I was selling, a lot of the artists I was working with, weren't really necessarily known to anyone. They're contemporary printmakers. So within printmaking, they're known, but people didn't tend to come in with this sense of like, oh, I know about Sean Caulfield. I took an art history class. I think I had it a bit easier than you, but you were in the old boys club.
I sure was.
And so I would see moments, when people would just not believe you or talk down to you. And I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that element of your experience.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So, I mean, like anything, there are some standout examples. Because as you mentioned, I'm a woman. I look younger than I am. I'm small of stature. I'm blonde. I have blue eyes, and so I did get a lot, of that perception that I was an intern or an assistant and not the director of the gallery. Mm-hmm. I would have people pat me on the head, like I wasn't cute. I literally had a gentleman, so Sam and a gentleman were like looking through the bins for something that I knew where it was, and so I approached them and I'm like, oh, do you need my help? And the gentleman Sam was speaking to literally turned his back on me and shushed me away, like with his hand, beckoned to me to leave them alone. Then there was another instance where I was with, a gentleman. He was bringing work in on consignment, and I was going through the paperwork with him, the consignment agreement, going over the terms with him. And at that point in time, Sam just happened to come downstairs. And so usually when it happens, as a courtesy, I introduce him like, oh, by the way, this is Sam Davidson. He's the owner of the gallery. Sam, this is so-and-so who is consigning some work with us. And this gentleman was also very, very tall, as was our boss. Very tall man. And he turns around and says, I swear, that's what I like to see, a tall man. And I remember that thinking okay, I know he didn't mean anything necessarily by that towards me in particular, but he just effectively said everything that I was not.
Yeah.
And immediately what happened was Sam took over that conversation, even though I had done all of the authentication and price research for this consignment. So, so there are those examples wherein I was dealing with a clientele that was overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly older. And so usually what would happen is I would have to prove myself. Mm-hmm. Effectively, I would have to outsmart them in order to prove that I was knowledgeable. And then usually in those instances, what I would get is wow, well, you sure know a lot about this. And so what I learned over the years at Davidson was how to navigate these waters gracefully. Because when you're a dealer, as angry as those situations can make you, you still are in a professional environment. You are representing the gallery and in your own professional face, and so flying off the handle is not going to help you. Mm-hmm. As a professional woman, it's only going to reinforce those stereotypes about women being emotional in the workplace. So I would just have to learn how to gracefully sidestep those comments and yet try and draw their attention to what they were saying. So usually when I would get that, so I was like, all right, I'm going to have to prove myself. And so I would, because I knew a darn lot about those pieces. And inevitably, I go, wow, well, you're really knowledgeable. And often I would just kind of step back and say, you sound surprised. And that usually had the effect that I wanted. I didn't offend them, but I very much pointed out that they were being condescending to me. Because, of course, I know. Well, they used to say, it's like, I have a master's degree, 10 years experience, and I'm a nice person.
That was it. Although I know it was never particularly comfortable for you, some of my favorite afternoons were watching you gracefully steer someone towards perhaps an unconscious bias. That worked really well. Yeah.
I remember you being quite amused by
Yeah. Or just like, I'd hear something come out of someone's mouth and I'd be like, this is going to be good.
Yeah. So it was a challenge, albeit though toward the, once I got more proficient at it, once I got more confident in myself, actually more importantly, I feel like when I first started Davidson, it was harder.
Yeah.
But once I had more confidence in myself, it became a lot easier to navigate those waters. And sometimes it was fun for me to have those triumphs. Not that I necessarily felt like I needed to lord my expertise over people, but just knowing that I was called to task and I could prove myself, even though it became tiring. I have to do it again and again and again. I still met that challenge each and every time. Every time.
Yeah. And I think that that's part of growing professionally in any field, is learning to know your worth. But particularly as a woman in an old boys club, that learning curve has to be a lot quicker in order for you to, keep your sanity, but also to thrive, I think.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think with a lot of women professionals too, like we can't just be as good as, we have to be better.
Right.
So I felt like I had to truly be an expert in a lot of the fields in order to countermand, something someone might be telling me. And one of the prime examples was this was at a fair, at a trade fair. I was not in my capacity as a print dealer at that time. I was working for another gallery, but I came across a booth that had 2 Dolly prints. Surprise, surprise. And one of them was an original lithograph, and the other was a reproduction. But he had them both as lithographs, and both at the same price. And I went over to him, and I'm like, so excuse me, I'm sorry, but did you, because again, like genuinely, I didn't know. Some people just don't know. So I went up to him like, I'm sorry, did you realize that one over there is in fact a reproduction print? And he, of course, and he was an older gentleman, he got all puffed up. Do you know who Field is and what the field guide is? And I was like, well, yeah, that's the catalog raisonné. That's the man who wrote one of the Dolly catalog raisonnés. Well, he authenticated both of these. And I was like, oh, really? And he like throws down these 2 certificates of authenticity. And I look at one, I look at the other. One says lithograph, one says chromolithograph. And I pointed at it and I was like, yeah, see right here, chromolithograph. That's a method of reproduction. So Dolly, it looks like Dolly signed this, and that's what Field is authenticating, but this is still a reproduction print. But like, he could so easily have diffused me in that moment, like if I didn't know off the cuff who Field was.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like, so because I made such an ardent study, like of all of the the prints and the raisonnés, I had to know that in that moment. So I always think back to that moment where like I couldn't just be as good as I had to be better. But not all of the clients that I dealt with were a daily struggle. I had so many delightful clients that were just painful to leave. I miss those working relationships.
Yeah, for sure. And they of course are what made our jobs worthwhile.
Definitely.
Yeah. So speaking of fairs, though, I get a lot of questions about the current state of art fairs, or really, I think more specifically, the current state of print fairs. What's your impression of their health, well-being, their validity, their necessity, all of that?
Oof. Um, Boy, that's tricky. Because with dealers who are in the secondary market, most of them are older. And as they get older and as they close their spaces, most of them aren't passing the galleries on to younger dealers. They're just closing. And so while the print fairs did seem to be dominated by secondary market, the future of the secondary market for me, at least at that point, was very unclear. Because I recall, for example, when we did the Portland Fine Art Print Fair, and we were there, the only dealers who were doing the secondary market who were under 50 were me and Bernard. I'm blanking on the gallery where
Armstrong.
he's working. Thank you, Armstrong. We were the only two. That's not to say that there isn't, a future for those spaces. I think with secondary market galleries and with contemporary galleries both, it just seems to me that the gap is widening. The bigger galleries are getting bigger and the smaller galleries are getting smaller. And it's just changing. Now, because there's a lot more online resources, like for secondary print dealing as well as primary market, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just is. But, there are those still a lot of the powerhouse galleries, a lot of the galleries that have solid reputation in print dealing that aren't going anywhere, like Gallery Saint-Étienne, for example. Gallery Saint-Étienne in New York City, one of the longest print galleries and one of the most reputable. And as far as I can tell, they're not going anywhere for a while. So I wish I had a more definitive answer for you. I think, honestly, it just remains to be seen. Because we are at a changing of the guard right now with secondary print galleries. And so I'm curious.
So just before we sign off, as we go through and we were talking about all these different things, you keep saying reputable galleries, reputable galleries. I'm wondering if you would feel comfortable just name dropping a few that you feel are reputable and that people can go to avoid the cruise ships.
So as we mentioned before, Armstrong Fine Art in Chicago, Gallery Saint-Étienne in New York. Oh, the gentleman in Portland. Ogden Gallery. There we go. Oh, William P. Carl Fine Prints in North Carolina, I believe. Another reputable dealer in Santa Rosa, California, is Annex Galleries. So those are some of the galleries that I dealt with personally. And if I'm forgetting anybody out there that I did deal with personally, I'm very sorry. But if you are out there and you are looking for a reputable gallery, a good resource for you is the IFPDA website. So that is the International Fine Print Dealers Association. And their site, it's a little wonky, but if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see a link that says member dealers. And on that page, you can look up by location. Unfortunately, it's just by city and not by state. So if anybody from the IFPDA is listening, maybe a search by state would be great.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and just throwing down your amazing print knowledge and sharing some war stories from the business as well. So if anyone wants to follow you and your continued art adventures, is there a way that they can do that through the internet?
So right now, the best way you can find me is on Instagram. Actually, my handle is artsy historian. artsy_historian. And there I have my art historian hat on most of the time for my posts. So I post a lot about contemporary arts that I like, historical artists in my new role I'm an art history professor now post gallery world employee, post gallerist. And so that is generally my persona on Instagram, is as art historian. So if you want to follow my exploits there, please do.
Wonderful. And I will definitely link to that as well. So thank you again, and we'll be in touch.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Okay. Bye. That's our show for this week. Tune in again in 2 weeks' time. So we had recorded the episode a couple of weeks ago that our listeners have just heard. Mm-hmm. And then I solicited everyone on Instagram for some questions to ask our gallerist here. And I got a few and some really good ones. And as you might be able to hear, I am no longer in my home doing this interview, but instead I'm in a litho studio. So I'm much more echoey. So I apologize to anyone who that bothers. We'll dive in. So Josephine asked, how does additioning and numbering affect the value of prints?
There's no difference between a 1 out of 50 and a 50 out of 50, and there is no difference between an artist proof and a numbered edition in terms of value. Often it will come down to, as far as value goes, it comes down to the name of the artist. Mm-hmm. There are going to be Dali, Giclées that are going to sell more for an original piece, by a lesser known artist, even if the edition is 2,000.
The next question from Emma, who asked, how did you get your start as a gallerist?
It's kind of a two-part story. I worked a lot in coffee shops and bookstores in college, and one of my painting professors came in one day and was like, oh, hey, Shayla, you know what? A friend of mine owns a gallery and is looking for somebody. Would you be interested? Well, maybe. What is it that she's looking to have done? And he's like, well, I don't know. Give her a call. So her name's, he told me, Jo Anderson, and she was the owner of Anderson O'Brien Gallery in Omaha, Nebraska. So I called the phone, I introduced myself, and I said, oh, yeah, so-and-so recommended me to you. And I was wondering, is the job still open? And what are you looking for? And she goes, do you know Photoshop? Yes, I do. Can you interview at 11 o'clock? And it was like 10:30. Yes, I can. So I go in, she points to the computer and she says, can you print this like such and such document so it shows the painting and all the information? So I'm thinking, okay, a test. Yes, I can do this. So I did it and I printed it and I gave it to her. It's like, okay, now I need this. And so effectively what happened is I ended up working like a 4-hour shift. And so I worked about 3 days before asking her, so do I have a job? It's like, oh yeah, I guess we should talk about your pay. So after that, I didn't expect really to get into gallery work because I went to graduate school for art history and was planning to teach, to get my PhD and to teach. So that's a longer story that I'll edit. And just suffice it to say, I decided to end at my master's. Fortune came along once again, and I had a professor who knew a gallery owner here in Seattle, Sam Davidson at Davidson Galleries, and gave me a referral to interview with him for his director of antique print. That got my foot in the door, and then my resume and my interview got me the job.
I think particularly for young people who are interested in getting started, just that ability to just, put yourself in situations, show up on time, do good work, be pleasant, and someone's going to look at you and be like, hey, the gallery down the street's looking for someone.
Yeah. For anyone out there looking to break in, the best thing you can possibly do is get involved. Mm-hmm. And depending on your circumstances, that could mean a full-fledged internship somewhere. You can also look at artist collectives or just start showing up, at art openings, talk to people, shake hands.
So the next question comes from Jane. And she had a really astute question about having relationships with multiple galleries when you make multiples. And she was actually specifically interested in when both galleries, for instance, are doing things like going to the same print fair.
So with most galleries, you will likely have a contract. And so the specifics of who else you can sell within the confines of that contract are just, they're going to be varied depending on who you're working with. But with most galleries, especially if they're selling prints, likely you're going to have some latitude to sell in other parts of the country or internationally. So, as long as you're working in a transparent manner within your contract, then no worries. Most galleries will give you that space to sell at other locations. The only times I can think of where you might have to limit what you send to a particular gallery is if you have an exhibition coming up. Because if you have arranged to do an exhibition with a particular gallery, they're going to want exclusivity to those works for a while. I'm guessing, again, like you always want, the best thing you can do is just be transparent with your gallery, but also be aware of your own worth and what they're doing for you. So if you have a gallery that is not really selling well, and they've demanded a pretty high exclusivity from you, then it's okay to question that.
And then how does it work with print fair?
As far as I know, that's up to the galleries to work out.
Yeah.
That is something, I will be honest, that is something that I did not encounter because I was the antique director. I think maybe you could be able to answer that question better.
Yeah. And so I would definitely say that yes, that is something that kind of honestly isn't your problem. Because if you have developed these relationships within the contracts offered by both galleries, that's kind of like you're doing your thing. You are upholding the professional side of that agreement. And honestly, when I would go to print fairs with contemporary work, like we might have Carol wax and someone else might have Carol wax, but chances are we didn't bring the same Carol wax pieces. And so the last question is, Tony asked, do artists still need galleries? And what are the benefits?
That is a really good question, and a question that I know a lot of artists are asking themselves. And so there are a lot of potential benefits of working with a gallery. So first, ask yourself, do you have enough time and energy to produce work and promote yourself daily? And I mean daily. And then if you are, and you do, look at your outlets. So say you are using Instagram, say you're using Etsy. Are you selling enough? Through your efforts, maybe your artist website, maybe you have a newsletter, any of the various things that you can do as an artist, are you actually generating the sales that you need and that you want? You might also ask yourself, can you manage and track your inventory? And one of the big things, really, honestly, about gallery representation is the prestige. Just to be perfectly frank, is the prestige important to you? Do you want, your work hanging, in a white cube space? Do you want to go to gallery openings? Do you want to do artist talks? Do you want to have that? And for some artists, the answer is yes, and that's awesome. And for some artists, it's no. Yeah, and that is also fine too. And then yeah. So to go towards this person's question, asking yourself, are you going to be frustrated by a gallery's rules about sales and exclusivity and commissions? You might also want to ask yourself if you're open to receiving criticism and advice about your work. Because there are some artists out there I know that would feel that to be a pitfall, something that they just can't, handle working with, and that's fine. If you really want that freedom to just do your art the way you want to do it and put it out there in that raw form, then go for it. Go maybe to an artist collective in spaces where you can really just express yourself free form and not have to worry about that. But if you do want to sell your work, if you do want to be a part of the business, as we talked about earlier, selling art is a business. If you do want to do that, one of the things that can be a benefit from a gallery, if you look at it that way, is receiving advice and criticism about your work.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good answer, because I think people get caught up a little bit in trying to find a hierarchy, that's sort of being with a gallery means you're X, Y, and Z, and not being with a gallery means you're X, Y, and Z. And that, one is better than the other. And in the end, it comes down to the individual person and what is right for them. So thank you again for coming back and being a part of our experimental artist interaction episode of Pine Copper Lime.
Oh, yes, happy to do it.
That's our show for this week. Tune in again in 2 weeks' time, when I'm going to chat with Our Lady of Cut Play. athlete in Talio Mastery, Allie Norman. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you around.